Hey everyone, welcome back to Intentional Money Moves Live. I'm Leah Hadley, and I am so glad that you're here with me. If you are new, we are now doing this every Monday at 1:30 Eastern Time. So if you are just joining us for the first time, make sure to subscribe, set up your notifications so you can join us every Monday for real money, real life, real questions, no jargon. So if you want to say hi, let me know that you're watching. I always love to know who is in the room. You can always drop it in the comments. If I don't get a chance to say hello, I will absolutely come back and read and answer any comments or questions that you may have. So today we're kicking off something new for the entire month of August. We're going to do a series that I'm calling Inflation Decoded. So that's going to be 5 Mondays. There's 5 Mondays in August, 5 pieces of the inflation puzzle, because inflation's everywhere right now. It's in the headlines, it's in your grocery bill. It's probably even come up at the dinner table more than once this year. And most of what gets said about it is typically either too complicated to be useful, or it's honestly designed to scare you. Hi, Jennifer. Thanks for being here. So here's my goal for this series. By the end of August, I want you to be able to hear an inflation headline and to know what it means, not to panic, not to shrug it off either, but just to understand it and to know what to do with that understanding. Hey, Poppy. Today we're starting at the very beginning. So, what inflation actually is and why it's not automatically a bad thing. That second part does tend to surprise people every time I say it, but I want you to bear with me so we have a full understanding here. And if I say something while I'm going through this and you're like, wait, what? Just drop it in the comments. I can't promise that I'm going to catch every comment or question right now, but I absolutely will come back and make sure to read them and respond to them. And what's really, really helpful, especially now, is I'm creating all the content for the next 4 weeks. So if you include your questions and your comments, I can make sure that we add that into the other episodes of Intentional Money Moves Live as part of this inflation series. All right, so let's just start with basics. What is inflation? So at the simplest terms, it's the prices rising over time, right? That's it. That's it. It's just prices rising over time. So for example, a cart of groceries that cost $100 last year now costs something like $103 or $104 this year, right? That's inflation. Now, here is the part that does tend to surprise people that have less familiarity, and that is that the Federal Reserve, the institution that's supposed to sort of manage us to around the inflation number, does not want inflation to be zero. They target about 2% inflation every year on purpose. Okay. And here's why. And this is the piece that I think helps to sort of reframe everything else we're going to be talking about throughout the month. So I do want everybody to kind of hear and sort of understand this. Here's a household way to think about the 2% target. Okay. When you build your budget, you don't plan down to the exact last dollar with zero room to move. That's very, very unusual. Most people are going to build in a little bit of cushion because a budget with no give is going to, quite frankly, it's going to snap the next thing, an unexpected thing comes up, right? The Fed is doing something very similar, but in the scale of kind of the whole broader economy, right? Tiny bit of built in inflation gives businesses room to increase wages. It gives, an opportunity to be able to adjust prices to adapt without the whole system just really seizing up in the moment that something changes. So zero really is not the safest number when we're talking about inflation, even though it may sound like it should be. It's really not. If you think about the economy kind of like a car and you think about inflation like a speedometer, if that speedometer reads zero, the car's not moving, nothing's happening, right? Businesses aren't growing, wages are not rising, nobody's hiring. That is not stability, right? That is stagnation. And if it goes further than that, if prices start falling, that's called deflation. And deflation is more dangerous than moderate inflation, not less. Okay. So I'm going to come back to that in a minute because I do think that that is the single most underexplained concept in personal finance. So I want to talk about that in just a minute. But on the other end, if that speedometer is redlining, if inflation is running in the high single digits or even 10% or more, that's the car going way too fast to control it. Okay. So when prices are rising faster than wages, faster than people can really plan for, that's when everyday life really feels harder and feels the impact of inflation, right? That's the kind of inflation that made the headlines in 2022. And it's the kind of inflation that most of us picture when we hear that word inflation. Okay. So where are we at right now? Um, the most recent report, inflation was running about 3.5%. So that's a little bit higher than the Fed's 2% target, but nowhere near it was when we saw those high single digits back in 2022. So I think if you think about it like this, we're not stalled and we're not redlining, right? We're cruising a little bit faster than what's ideal, but nowhere close to kind of out of control based on the numbers that we've seen. So, in between those two extremes, right, a slow, steady climb of about 2% a year, right? That's the sweet spot. That's a car that is cruising at a safe, sustainable speed. It means that the economy is growing, that businesses have the confidence to hire and to invest, right? Wages tend to rise alongside pricing over time. So it's a sign of life, not a sign of trouble. Now, if you are a business owner watching today, that cushion matters for you too, right? It gives you room to adjust pricing, to adjust payroll gradually instead of every cost shift really feeling like an emergency, right? So when you hear inflation is up, the first question I really want you to start asking isn't, is that bad? I want you to really start asking yourself, it's compared to what, right? If inflation is up, it's up compared to what and how fast? Because the context really is critical to understanding the impact. Okay. Now, I know some of you are sitting there thinking, okay, but 2022 didn't feel like a sign of life. It felt awful. And you're right. You are absolutely right. It did. Because it wasn't that 2% sweet spot that we were talking about, right? It was when we saw prices going up in the high single digits in a year, wages just couldn't keep up. They just couldn't keep up fast enough. And that gap between what things are costing and what people are earning, that's really what made 2022 feel very painful for a lot of households. Now, I'm not going to tell you that inflation never hurts. I'm telling you that the pace is really what determines where we see the impact. And I think that's really important to understand, right? Two very different situations that we're talking about, but we're still talking about inflation, right? So I'm going to drop in the comments if 2022 is what comes to mind for you when you hear the word inflation. I'm just curious, or if there's another time period. I know when my grandparents were alive, they used to love to talk to me about the inflation in the 80s, right? So I'm just curious what you all think about when, or if there's a time period that you think about when you think about inflation. All right, now I want to address deflation though. Okay. So let's just sit with this for a second because it's very unusual for people to really talk about it. And I think it's really important to understand why economists are not trying to get inflation to zero. I do think there is some important context here, right? If prices are falling, that may sound good on the surface. I like a deal. I get it, right? Your dollar buys more. But here's what I want you to think about what that does to behavior. Okay. Now, if you know that you're in the market for a car and you know that that car is going to be cheaper next month, what are you going to do? For most of us, if we know we just have to wait a month, most of us are going to wait until it's cheaper to buy, right? And if everybody waits, what happens? There's no sales happening, right? And if there's no sales happening for a business, then they're going to stop hiring and then they may have to lay people off. And that's how people lose jobs. And then they spend even less, right? So you can see how that can kind of perpetuate, right? And now prices fall even further because nobody's buying, right? Now you've done a version of this yourself. Even if you've never thought about it, in terms of economics. You could think about it in terms of even just like holiday shopping, right? Waiting to get that deal on Black Friday, or like maybe an end of the season clearance. Maybe you're waiting to buy a coat, right? But you're holding off, it's October, but you're holding off till November because you think the prices are going to be lower, right? That's completely rational, absolutely and completely rational as an individual shopper. Okay. But here's what I want you to think about. Picture that happening across an entire economy all at once, indefinitely, with no sale date at the end. So everybody's holding off on everything all the time because they expect it to be cheaper tomorrow. That is a deflationary spiral. That's what that actually feels like. It doesn't feel like a bargain, right? It feels like a standstill. And if you are a business owner, I do want you to pay close attention here. Deflation is not abstract. It's your customers doing exactly this, right? Delaying the purchase, waiting for a better price. That's demand that's drying up on your books. And it's part of why moderate inflation is actually really good for revenue and not something to be afraid of. Okay. In reality, when we see a deflationary spiral, it's one of the harder economic problems to fix. So I think the most common modern example that people tend to talk about as it relates to this specific issue is Japan, right? And it's something that we kind of saw for the better part of 2 decades. It took an enormous sustained effort to get their economy moving again. Businesses didn't want to invest, wages weren't moving. Now, it wasn't a dramatic crash. It was just a very, very long, slow flat line. And sometimes that flat line can be harder to escape than actually a sharper downturn. So, when the Fed is out there trying to keep inflation around 2%, they're not being careless with your money, okay? They're trying to keep the car cruising instead of stalling out or spinning out. Both extremes are very dangerous. And the moderate middle really is the goal that we're looking for. And we have lived through some real world preview of what happens when things tip toward deflation. And it wasn't that long ago, right? I mean, I think a lot of us have some very strong memories, right, from the spring of 2020 when the pandemic first hit and everything shut down and prices on a lot of goods actually fell for a few months, right? Oil prices collapsed so hard that futures briefly traded below zero. The Fed cut interest rates to nearly nothing almost overnight because they were seriously, seriously concerned about a deflationary spiral taking hold while nobody was spending. And it didn't turn into the kind of prolonged flat line that Japan went through, partly because of how aggressively the Fed and Congress responded. But it's a real example in a relatively recent memory for a lot of people. So I think that's kind of helpful to keep that in mind. I do want to be clear about something though. Understanding that moderate inflation is normal and healthy does not necessarily mean your personal experience of rising prices isn't real. It is absolutely real. Your grocery bill, your rent, your gas tank, those numbers absolutely matter in your life, regardless of what's healthy for the broader economy. I get that. Absolutely. So, next week, we're going to talk about the gap between the official inflation numbers and what you're actually feeling in your day to day life, because the gap is real and the gap is really important to understand for personal financial planning purposes. So, we'll talk about that next week. But here's a question that I get a lot. If deflation is so dangerous, why does it feel wrong that prices never seem to come back down after they spike? And honestly, it's a fair question. It is a fair question. And the honest answer is that prices are sticky on the way down. Businesses do raise prices quickly when their costs are going up, but they rarely lower them just because costs ease, because they've gotten used to that level of revenue, right? That's a separate conversation from what the deflation that we're talking about today. That is a separate conversation, okay? More of a fairness issue than an economic one. And it's a real source of frustration. I'm not dismissing it at all. I just want to be precise about specifically what problem we're talking about, right? Because the fix for one is not the fix for the other, all right? So if this is landing for you, or maybe it's raising some questions for you about what about, or please drop it in the comments. Again, I'm going to come back through and really read through any of the comments and questions that we're getting to help me prepare for the next 4 sessions where we're diving deeper into different aspects of inflation. But I want to make this concrete because a definition and a car metaphor are only going to go so far for you, right? So here is a basket of everyday groceries. So eggs, milk, bread, ground beef, gas for your car, right? In 2020, that basket costs somewhere around $85 to $90 for a lot of households. Okay. Today, that same basket runs closer to something like $110 to $115. That is the lived experience of inflation, right? It's not abstract. It's not the number on the receipt. I always think about, what was the price of a tank of gas when I started driving all those years ago, right? Let's break a few of those items down individually though, because the average actually hides some different stories. And I think it's helpful for people to really see this. Okay. So a gallon of gas averaged in 2020 about $2.20 a gallon. Today, it's closer to $3. Sometimes it's higher than that, sometimes a little lower. It's going to partially depend on what area of the country you live in. It's also going to depend on what's happening with oil prices in that particular week, right? That's a real increase. It's been bumpy. It's not been a straight climb, but a very real increase, right? Another example, a gallon of milk in 2020 was something like $3. Now it's something like $4.20, right? That one has actually been a pretty steady climb instead of the bumpiness that we've seen in oil and gas. Now, eggs are an interesting example, right? I think it's an interesting example because there's been different variables at play, right? When it comes to eggs. In 2020, a dozen eggs averaged about $1.60. Now, at various points over the last several years, that price has spiked to well over $3, even touched much higher than that in some reasons before coming back down. Now, that was not the Federal Reserve, right? That wasn't the broader economy overheating. That was actually like portions of supply being wiped out, right? And it happened again and again. So when supply dropped, price did what price does when supplies drop, right? When supplies drop, that's not going to be monetary inflation. That is going to be, the response to a supply and demand issue, right? And I think that's important to understand, right? That, what the Fed was doing with interest rates was not going to impact the price of eggs if it's a supply and demand issue. And if you run a business where food, fuel, packaging, if these are big line items in your business, your own version of this basket is going to vary, right? And it's worth taking a look at what does this basket of goods look like for you specifically, right? Maybe you have more medical costs and maybe you've seen much higher inflation with your healthcare related expenses, right? I'm walking you through that because I want you to start being able to tell the difference when you hear that the price has gone up for something. That it's not just inflation, right? I want you to really start to understand the variables that move pricing. Sometimes it is absolutely the broad economy wide inflation we've been talking about throughout this whole episode, right? Sometimes that's the case, but sometimes it may be a supply shock in a particular category like eggs, right? Or if we look back, longer time ago, lumber was a big issue, right? Used cars during the pandemic, right? Those get lumped into the same headline all the time. All the time they get lumped into the same headline. They are not the same problem. And so that's why I want to make sure that as we're really trying to gain a comprehensive understanding here, that we're pointing to some of the noise that can really start to confuse some of these issues. Okay. Now here's where it gets interesting and where I want you to start thinking a little bit differently. The government's official inflation number, the consumer price index, is built from a huge basket of goods and services, right? Groceries, yes, electronics, clothing, medical care, housing, entertainment, right? All together. Some of those categories have actually gotten cheaper. And some of those categories have not, right? So electronics are a good example. When you hear inflation cooled to 3%, that is a blended average across a massive basket of goods. So it might not match your basket of goods, right? Depending on what your personal situation is. If your monthly spending is heavy on groceries, childcare, rent, categories that have run higher than the overall average, you may be feeling like that headline number just does not match your reality. And you'd be right, okay? You would be right. It may not for your specific life, okay? And that disconnect between sort of that headline number and what people are feeling is one of the biggest reasons people feel like they're being told one thing by the news and living a completely different experience. It's not that the number is fake, okay? But it is that it's an average, and averages, quite frankly, averages hide a lot, right? When I was in undergrad, I studied sociology, and I focused my degree in statistics. I was very interested in quantitative sociology, which I'm sure won't surprise very many of you. But what I really enjoyed about studying statistics in particular, and I was a teaching assistant for statistics, and I ran the stat lab. It was something that I really, really enjoyed. But the fact of the matter is you can have the numbers show a story that you're trying to tell, right? And so I think it's important when we use the word average, we really understand what does that actually mean, okay? And so if you really want to look and see what is your personal inflation number, right? Here's what you want to do. You want to take a look at what are you actually spending money on? Right? Your household maintenance, right? Maintaining your home, your utilities, your gas, your childcare, your property taxes, right? Look at the specific costs that you have in your line items and how they've changed because that's going to be your own personal rate of inflation. And like I said, you may have certain expenses that are part of your budget that have gone up more so, right? Maybe if you're in an area of the country where gas is particularly expensive and you drive a lot, that may have had a bigger impact than what that headline number says, right? So, and I know I hear it all the time. My costs are up, but my paycheck's not. What am I supposed to do with that? Right. And it's a fair question. Now, it's not one that we're going to answer today, but I do want you to understand today the factors that are really driving this. And we're going to spend the next several weeks, right? We have 4 more weeks where we're going to talk specifically about how do you take this information, this context, and apply it to your specific financial plan, right? But I don't want to rush past any of this because I think that when we try to just sort of globalize advice or we just kind of rush through it, I see a lot of bad advice online. Okay. So I'm asking you to really take a step back first and sit with the understanding piece just for another week before we get more tactical. Okay. But if you do want to share what's in your basket or what you're seeing climbing, you're welcome to put it in the chat in the comments, and we will absolutely respond to it. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. Today, I really want you to understand that inflation is not the villain. Okay, inflation is not the villain. It is a variable, and it is a sign of a healthy, growing economy. The danger zones are the extremes, right? Too fast, that's going to erode your buying power very, very quickly. Too slow, and we have the potential to tip into something that's worse, excuse me. So here's what's coming up for the rest of August. Next Monday, we are going to be decoding the headlines. I'm going to talk about some real recent headlines, the ones about the Fed, about the CPI reports, about recession fears, and we're going to translate exactly what they mean in plain English. Okay. We're going to pull actual headlines from the last few weeks, go through them line by line because a huge, huge amount of financial anxiety comes from headlines that are designed to grab your attention, but not to actually inform you. Okay. The Monday after that, we're going to be talking about the sneaky ways that inflation shows up, things like shrinkflation, where the price may stay the same, but the product may get smaller. What's actually happening to your paycheck once you factor in rising prices. And you're going to leave that episode able to spot it in your own pantry. Okay. Week 4, we are talking about who inflation actually helps and who it hurts because it's not evenly distributed. And it's important to understand that. Debt behaves differently than savings when prices are rising. And once you understand who's on which side of that, you can position yourself smarter instead of just kind of absorbing whatever happens, right? We're going to close the series with week 5, where we're going to turn everything I've talked about for the first 4 weeks of August into an actual plan, how to build inflation into your financial decisions permanently. So you're never going to be caught off guard by a headline again. And that is also the episode where we're going to be talking about what to actually do if your income is not keeping up with inflation, which I know some of you are struggling with that right now. So be sure to tune into that episode if that is an area that feels challenging for you right now. Now, I did create a little cheat sheet for you that goes over some of the big topics that we talked about today. It's just a basic understanding of inflation, but I think it's a really nice reference guide and a helpful context for those of you who might be feeling a little bit unfamiliar with this content. So you can opt in for it at watchherthrive.co/inflation sheet. I put it there at the bottom of your screen for you, and there is a link in the chat as well. But make sure that if you need some reference or some tools, just help remind you of some of the vocabulary and things that we've talked about today in preparing for the next 4 sessions, make sure you grab that. There's going to be a reference sheet with each and every episode. And so we'll start sending those out with the episode announcement. So just make sure you're on our email list if that's something that is of interest to you. And if you opt in for the inflation cheat sheet, then you absolutely will be. All right. So let me leave you with the one thing I want you to walk away with today. Okay. Inflation on its own at a moderate pace, that is not an alarm. That is a normal feature of a growing economy. What matters is the pace. And what matters even more is whether your own income and your own plan are keeping up with that. That's what we're really going to be building toward all month. That's the most important thing. And, you know, keep in mind, yes, a little inflation is absolutely normal and it's a sign of a healthy economy, not a warning sign, right? But 2, I want you to remember that deflation, prices falling, is the scenario that worries economists more, okay? Because of how quickly it can freeze up spending and freeze up hiring, okay? And the number you hear on the news, I also want to just remind you that's a blended average, and your personal inflation experience, your personal inflation rate, it may be different than that. That's built on what you're actually spending on, right? And so if you want to get an idea of how, your own spending on the same goods, how that cost has changed, you can start to track those things on your own. And I just want to reiterate that if today's episode brought up questions, please come back, put them in the comments, because again, as I'm preparing the content for each of these episodes, I want to make sure that I'm pulling in everything that you've shared, everything that you've asked. So I want to just encourage you to keep those questions coming in. So that way, and I will say, this is one of those things. I'm going to just say this. This is one of those things where, and I have to pop off here in just a moment. This is a topic that everybody feels like they, quote, should know and should understand. Okay. And it's a topic that the vast majority of people who never took an economics class never actually had somebody sit down and help them understand. Okay. So if you're sitting here thinking this is something you should, and so you don't want to ask the question, I can guarantee you, if you have the question in your head, somebody else has the question too. So I just really want to invite you and encourage you to share your questions about this topic. This is something that unless you've taken the time to learn and understand, it's a dynamic topic that has a lot of variables that impact it, right? If it's not something that you've taken the time to learn and understand, why would you know it? Why would you know it? Right? So now's the time. Now we're taking a step back and we're getting some good context and really understanding how this is going to impact your financial plan. And if this was helpful, do make sure that you subscribe and sign up for notifications so that you absolutely know when the next several episodes will be. But they will be each Monday for the next 4 weeks on the topic of inflation decoded. And I just want to thank you for taking the time to be with us today, for joining us, for sharing any questions that you do have in the chat. And again, I will absolutely come back and respond to those as we go. I hope you have a fantastic afternoon, and I will see you next week.